Most gardeners ruin their soil the same way every season. They pour chemical fertilizer into beds thinking more nutrients will automatically mean bigger harvests. What actually happens is the opposite. The soil slowly loses its microbial life, plants become dependent on constant feeding, and yields start dropping unless you keep increasing the dosage. I've seen this happen in backyard gardens, raised beds, and even hydroponic systems that rely too heavily on synthetic inputs. The growers who consistently avoid that trap tend to think about soil biology first, not just nutrients. And one of the most effective examples I've seen of this comes from traditional Amish farming practices. Instead of relying on synthetic fertilizers, many Amish growers feed their crops with a fermented plant tea that acts more like a biological stimulant than a conventional fertilizer. If you're serious about growing food and improving your soil long-term, subscribe to the channel now, because most of what we cover here focuses on practical methods like this that actually perform in real gardens. The first thing to understand is that this fermented tea isn't just plant food. It's more like a microbial engine that wakes up the soil. Chemical fertilizers deliver nutrients directly to plants, but fermented teas deliver microbes, enzymes, and organic acids that help the soil release nutrients that are already there. That difference matters a lot once you've been gardening for a few seasons. In my raised beds, I tested this side by side against a standard granular fertilizer program. The beds that received fermented plant tea every 2 weeks showed noticeably darker leaves, thicker stems, and much stronger root systems. The fertilizer-fed beds grew fast early on but needed constant feeding to maintain the same pace. The real advantage of fermented teas shows up in the soil biology. The reason Amish growers rely on fermented teas has a lot to do with how they manage soil fertility without expensive inputs. When plant material ferments, microbes break it down and release compounds that stimulate microbial activity in the soil. This process creates a liquid rich in beneficial bacteria, trace minerals, amino acids, and organic acids. When you apply it to soil, you're not just feeding the plant, you're feeding the entire underground ecosystem that supports the plant. In practical terms, that means nutrients become more available without dumping chemical salts into the soil. Over time, the soil structure really improves, water retention increases, and roots start to spread more aggressively. That's exactly what I've seen in raised beds that have been using fermented plant teas for several seasons. The soil becomes darker, looser, and honestly, just easier to work with. Even during those dry periods, the beds stay productive because the soil holds moisture so much better. So let's talk about how this fermented garden tea is actually made. The base recipe Amish growers use is simple, but surprisingly effective. It starts with fresh green plant material, usually nitrogen-rich weeds or herbs. Stinging nettle, comfrey, dandelion leaves, grass clippings, and, vegetable scraps all work well. I usually fill a 5-gallon bucket about 3/4 full with chopped plant material. Then I add water until everything is submerged. Rainwater works best, but honestly, tap water works fine if you let it sit for a day so the chlorine dissipates. At this point, fermentation begins. I loosely cover the bucket and let it sit in a shaded area for about 10 to 14 days. During that time, microbes break down the plant tissue and release nutrients into the liquid. By the end of the process, the mixture smells strong, almost like manure tea. That smell tells you the fermentation has done its job. Before applying it, the liquid gets diluted. In my garden, I mix about 1 part fermented tea with 10 parts water. That ratio keeps it strong enough to feed the soil without overwhelming young plants. So, where does this method work best in real gardens? Well, in a backyard garden bed, the easiest way to use fermented tea is as a soil drench. I usually apply about 1 litre of diluted tea per square metre of bed every 2 weeks during active growth. Tomatoes respond extremely well to this treatment. In my test beds, tomatoes receiving fermented tea developed thicker stems and stronger flowering clusters compared to the beds receiving standard fertilizer alone. Leafy greens also benefit because the microbial activity helps release nitrogen gradually instead of flooding the soil with soluble fertilizer. Another place this method works well is raised beds that have been producing vegetables for years. Those beds often suffer from nutrient imbalances and compacted soil. Applying fermented tea regularly restores biological activity and helps the soil rebalance itself. So, hydroponic growers can still use fermented teas, but it really has to be handled carefully. In hydroponic systems, the root environment is very different because, well, there's no soil ecosystem to buffer microbes. Raw fermented tea can clog systems or introduce unwanted bacteria if it's added directly to your nutrient reservoirs. What I've done successfully is use extremely filtered fermented tea as a microbial inoculant in passive hydroponic setups, like Kratky containers. The tea must be strained thoroughly through cloth or fine mesh to remove all solids. Even then, the dosage should stay very light, about 1 tablespoon per gallon of nutrient solution. The goal here isn't to replace hydroponic nutrients, but to introduce beneficial microbes that help root health. In deep water culture systems, I usually avoid it altogether because pumps and air stones can become contaminated. Why compost quality determines how powerful this tea becomes. One thing many gardeners overlook is that, honestly, fermented plant teas perform much better when paired with high-quality compost. The compost acts as a microbial reservoir that multiplies the organisms introduced by the tea. But, compost quality varies dramatically depending on how the pile is managed. A compost pile that never heats up properly produces weak compost with limited microbial diversity. On the other hand, a well-managed pile that reaches thermophilic temperatures creates extremely active compost full of beneficial organisms. This is where monitoring compost temperature makes a huge difference. I started using a long probe thermometer a few years ago because, well, I wanted to know what was actually happening in the center of my compost piles. The one I've been using is the Rio Temp 20-inch backyard compost thermometer. It has a long stainless probe that reaches into the core of the pile, where the real microbial activity happens. Once I started checking temperatures, I realized some of my piles were barely active while others were running at 60 degrees Celsius and producing much richer compost. That tool basically removed the guesswork. If you're interested in it, I've put the link in the description so you can take a look. And the better your compost is, the more powerful your fermented teas become because the soil microbes have a stronger ecosystem to work with. The biggest mistake people make with fermented garden teas, the most common mistake is applying it too strong. Gardeners assume that because it's organic, more must be better. But fermented tea is biologically active, and applying it at full strength can overwhelm young plants or create oxygen issues in the soil. Dilution matters. The 1:10 ratio I mentioned earlier is reliable for most crops, and I rarely go stronger than that. The second mistake is letting the tea ferment too long. After about 3 weeks, the microbial balance starts shifting toward less beneficial organisms. At that point, the liquid becomes less useful for plants. I usually make small batches every 2 weeks instead of storing large amounts. Why this old method still outperforms many modern fertilizers. The Amish approach to fertility works because it focuses on the living soil instead of just feeding the plant directly. Chemical fertilizers can certainly produce fast growth, but they rarely improve soil structure or microbial diversity. Fermented plant teas do both. Over time, the soil becomes more resilient, more fertile, and more productive with fewer external inputs. That's the real goal for any serious gardener who wants to grow better food year after year. So if you've been relying heavily on chemical fertilizers, try running a small experiment. Brew a batch of fermented plant tea, dilute it properly and apply it to one section of your garden for a full season. Watch how the soil responds. Look at the leaf color, root development, and overall plant vigor. You might be surprised how powerful a bucket of fermented weeds can be. And if you want more practical techniques like this that actually work in real gardens, subscribe to the channel and share this video with another grower who's trying to build healthier soil. Because honestly, the best harvests don't come from buying more fertilizer. They come from understanding how to work with the biology that's already in your soil